So now let's look at what are we really testing, since we've already confused everybody with what the definitions are. Most of the recent testing that has been put out there is really looking at shelters, and the primary tool that they're doing is to look at predicting aggression and potential adoption candidates. And as I stated before, that's obviously a major public health concern. They're also starting to screen for specific behavior problems, so things like separation anxiety, food or resource guarding, the types of things that your more adoptable animals may be developing or becoming apparent after adoption. Other things that they're still being used for is looking at animal success as a working dog or a service dog. And so what are we really testing? So in the simplest form, when you break it down to the very basics, a temperament test is testing a behavioral response to a very specific stimulus at that time in that certain environment by that individual dog. So it's a behavior evaluation. It's a snapshot in time of that dog's behavior. And that's something that we know. I mean, that's something that we can prove. The thing that gets things a little muddy, however, is that we're trying to use that known and extrapolate to different situations. So we're trying to correlate that specific response in that situation in that individual animal at that time as a predictor of how that same animal is going to respond in a similar situation at a different time. And therefore, that would theoretically be predicting temperament and or personality, depending on which one you want to call it. And this is something that we look at external validity. So can we take what we know here in our testing population and apply it to the rest of the population out in the real world? And this is something we don't know. We haven't determined that yet, officially at least. So things that we don't know about these tests. We don't know what the effect of stress in the shelter environment has on these displayed behaviors. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone, we know is elevated, at least initially, in dogs going into a shelter environment. Depending on which study you read is how long that stays high, and some pets we've actually found that it continues to increase as their stress level doesn't decrease over time. And so if you look at some people in the area, they would say that the dog should be given a period of adjustment before we testing, so we're not adding that stress into the unknown mix of things that can change our test results. And then you have other people in the field who say, well, yeah, the dogs are stressed, but we're more likely to identify aggression in a stressed dog who's already close to threshold. And so maybe this is when we really need to be testing these dogs so we can weed out the ones who are going to potentially show aggression at home. Other things we don't know, again, we looked at our definitions. What are we really testing? Are we looking at behavior at that snapshot in time? We know we are doing that. But how does that correlate to character, temperament, and or personality? And so going back to the review of all the literature that's been out there, we know that there are some studies who have shown that their behavioral responses, they call them constructs in the research field, they are stable over time. So they'll test these same dogs again later and come up with the same responses on these tests. And so theoretically, you could be measuring temperament because temperament's assumed to be stable over time, right? But there's also questions that can you actually get a valid assessment with that overwhelming and unnatural environment in the shelter? Because we know that obviously is going to change a dog's behavior than what it is in a home environment. And again, if you look at the testing parameters through these different studies, a lot of the dogs that they're using are known owned animals in a stable environment versus those who are in an unfamiliar shelter type environment. And that could potentially change how the dog tests. And so when we're looking at tests, as I said earlier, test battery is going to be the most commonly used format in the shelter world. And when you're setting up the tests, there may be two different categories of how they're trying to set them up. They may take a situation or interaction that's going to be commonly done in a average pet home. So maybe hugging a dog or petting it or getting it riled up in play, like that, trying to take a toy away. Or they may even go so far as to try to provoke a pet in a highly challenging or stressful situation. So maybe they're going to have a stranger physically threaten the owner while the dog's on leash next to it. And obviously that's going to be a very provocative situation for a dog. And then there's also some concerns that there are some types of aggression that may not be able to be identified through these test batteries in a shelter situation. So you may look at things like interspecies aggression, dog-to-dog aggression within a social group. If the dog doesn't have a social group in the shelter, how are you going to pick up whether that's going to be an issue at home? Also with predatory behavior, if you're not exposing the dog to the certain stimuli that may evoke that, and we know predatory behavior tends to be stimulated by a hunger response, again, that may be really challenging to set up in a shelter situation. Same type of thing with territorial. If the dog's not been there long enough to set up its kennel or cage area as its territory, we may not pick this up again. And also there have been a few studies that have looked at young puppies, because that would be ideal to be able to test some of these puppies and determine what their temperament is going to be as an adult. And depending on what age group that you're looking at these puppies, you're finding that there's not really a whole lot of good correlation. And again, some of the really recent stuff that's coming out, within the last 6 months or so, they are finding that it may correlate a little more. The older the puppies are, the further away they are from their socialization or developmental stages. But again, there's not enough evidence there to say that, yes, we can test little puppies and determine what type of dog they're going to be. And so, as we said, at this time, we don't know whether these tests are truly predictive or not. What happens if we get false positive results? So dogs are testing, showing aggression with these very challenging testing situations, is that we've got dogs who are getting euthanized for aggression that may never show aggression in the home environment. Or we could potentially be getting false negative results, which is just as bad. We could be putting dogs out on the adoption floor that are a serious public safety risk. So there's certain issues with each side of that.